Good evening, everybody. Steve with Real Progressives. It's been a long time since I've had an opportunity to speak with my good friend, Tim Canova. Let me tell you, before we get started with Tim has been slugging it out for years. And when I say years, I'm talking about a tough several years against an incumbent so grotesquely against the people, so anti-progressive, that it is in all of our best interests to take notice of Tim's campaign and take notice of the levels of corruption and the levels of hurdles that the establishment has put forward to try to keep Tim from succeeding. So what I'm going to do without further ado is bring on my good friend, Tim Canova. Welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be with you in Real Progressives.
Absolutely. It's been a while, man. I really miss you. It's been a great experience for me just having a guy like you that I consider to be a friend and someone that is a champion for everything that we want to see happen in America. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Steve. I appreciate everything you're doing at Real Progressives. You guys have become a real force, an intellectual force, I think, and making a difference in people's discussions and the way they look at the world.
Thank you so much. So, Tim, let's just jump right in. You've got some really heavy stuff going on there in Florida. I mean, election integrity, especially with the way the primaries were rigged against the people. I forget Bernie, just the people that fought for him.
Right.
You've got a real situation down there with the ballots being destroyed in Florida. Talk to us about that.
Well, after our August 2016 primary, a number of folks were urging me to contest the election, but we weren't really so close in the official count that it would have been an easy thing to do. And I got to say, that campaign, we were working our tails off the whole time, and when we hit the finish line, all I wanted to do was sleep for a week or two. It took a while before a bunch of election integrity folks started to contact me and to express their concerns that maybe the final count is not an accurate one. I'm not an election expert. My area as a law professor, for instance, as you know, it deals much more with the economy. But I listened to what folks had to say, and I decided, well, let's put in a request to inspect ballots in maybe a dozen precincts. My district has, I think, over 300 precincts, and we figured let's pick a dozen of precincts and just inspect the ballots. Florida has a very strong Public Records Act, which allows ordinary citizens to inspect any public records, and it's very clear that ballots are public records. And even though we couldn't, under the law, we're not allowed to touch the ballots, we're allowed to inspect them, and we would be paying for the inspection. The employees of the supervisor of elections would be the ones holding the ballots up for our inspections. And we put in a request in November, I believe, of last year initially. And we asked to see the paper ballots and also the digital scanned images. And we were told pretty quickly that they had not done any digital scans, which we thought was a little strange because here in Florida, we have paper ballots that are all run through the scanning machines where that's the way they're counted. And it's really just a matter of hitting one toggle switch, so to speak, for the scanning to also take a digital image of each of the ballots. And we were told they didn't do that. So that seems strange, but we continued on with our public records request, and we figured, well, let's inspect the paper ballots. The paper ballots, of course, are the best evidence of what happened, whereas the digital scanned images, from what I was learning at the time, could be easily manipulated by a manipulation of the software of the scanning machines. And there's believe me, a very big literature out there, and there've been a number of instances where there were hacking contests and where graduate students hacked into electronic voting systems. So we were okay with moving forward and trying to inspect the paper ballots. And we made this request to the Broward County Supervisor of Elections. And they really jerked us around for months. And this past June, we decided to sue. I decided to sue the Broward Supervisor of Elections in state court under Florida's Public Records Act. And in the course of that litigation, we recently discovered that the Broward Supervisor of Elections destroyed all of the paper ballots in my primary. And that would certainly appear to be a violation of both state and federal law that requires paper ballots to be maintained for 22 months. It also came in the context of the litigation itself. In the order to destroy the ballots, the supervisor attested that there was no pending litigation that the ballots were subject of. So that was a false affirmation, you can say, a false statement, and destruction of evidence in an ongoing litigation. And that's really where we're at right now. It still, we're still are not sure where things will go from here. I think the proper response would be for some investigations by federal and state authorities. We can perhaps inspect. Oh, I should let me back up and say that we also discovered that indeed they did do digital scanned images after all, even though a year ago they told us they did not. So one possibility is to try to inspect the digital scanned images, but for that to make any sense, we'd really need to inspect the software that was used for scanning these images. So this is what I'm telling you is what I'm learning from the experts, and it does sort of beg the question: why would the supervisor of elections destroy ballots in violation not just of a court order but of federal law if there was not something they were hiding? So it's been very disturbing, and I'm glad that we stayed on top of it. A lot of my supporters around the country, small donor supporters, you could say, wanted us to push this issue, and we heard what they had to say, and we are pushing the issue. We're not going to let up on it. The United States of America is very much an embarrassment when it comes to our election infrastructure. And the ballot counting is not transparent or verifiable the way it is in other countries. There are a number of international studies that have been done, comparative studies, that rank the United States dead last out of democracies in this world in terms of election integrity. It's absolutely shameful. I'm a law professor. My students can go online and verify the grades that they receive. And in this day and age, this computer age, as voters, we can't verify our votes. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of recourse. And of course, members of Congress of both parties seem to be okay with the status quo. And it's just completely unacceptable.
You bring up a good point, Tim. When I'm sitting there watching, the progressive movement as a whole focused heavily on the DNC lawsuit. There are little lawsuits like your own, little being, relative, all over the country. I mean, there's cases of fraud. There's cases of basic just violations of the law.
Yes.
Everywhere. And, in order to have people have security and feeling like there's integrity in the vote, we've got to do something.
Absolutely.
What do you have any suggestions? I know you said you weren't an expert in this, but have you been approached with any ideas that might work for the U.S.?
Well, I've been reading up an awful lot, you can imagine, in the past year or so. So while I'm not an expert on a lot of the details, I certainly have started to form my own views on what needs to happen. And when we look at Western Europe, we see all over Western Europe, these democracies have banned the electronic voting machines. 15, 20 years ago, many of us were disturbed when a private company named Diebold, it was alleged, took part in rigging the election for George W. Bush against Al Gore, and then perhaps the state of Ohio 4 years later for Bush against John Kerry. Diebold doesn't exist anymore, but they essentially changed their name, sold their assets to another election company, and not much has changed as far as this kind of black box voting, where we cast our votes and we just have faith that the system works and it'll be counted properly, and there's no reason to have that kind of faith. There is a county in upstate New York, not that far upstate, but I think it's Columbia County, and they have a very interesting system in which they have these machines, they get the machine tally, but they double check it by having a hand recount of every single ballot. And they do it right there on election day, election night. And it's a bipartisan effort. And it's very similar, I think, to what happens in Western Europe. When Britain voted, for instance, their Brexit vote, every ballot was counted by hand, paper ballots counted by hand in public and reported at the local precinct level. And they counted all those ballots for that entire very large country, I think, by midnight. This is something that we should be doing. If the machines are going to stay, we should certainly not rely completely on the machines. We should be counting paper ballots by hand in public and reporting at the local precinct level. When you mention these lawsuits all over the country, there was one case that I think many of your viewers probably are aware of. New York City Board of Elections signed a consent decree from a lawsuit that was brought by some private plaintiffs, election watchdog group, I believe, and then the Justice Department, the U.S. Justice Department joined in on the suit. And the New York City Board of Elections admitted to purging over 200,000 people from the voting list in the days before their 2016 presidential primary, their Democratic presidential primary, 120,000 voters in Brooklyn alone. And they admitted what they did, and they promised they would never do it again. And we're supposed to be satisfied with that kind of a consent decree. It's very reminiscent, I think, of the kinds of consent decrees that the Justice Department reached with the big Wall Street banks. I'm very sorry for this interruption.
That's okay. That's okay. So while you take it, I'm going to just go ahead. So Tim, one of the things that I feel is important to discuss, quite frankly, going back, you and I have been involved in several actions together, marches and different events where third parties came together, and ultimately it has been a situation where you and I were around people that were looking to dem exit, so to speak.
Yes.
And during this process, it was like, look, I am a progressive. I want all the things you want, but I see right now my best shot at being able to win this thing is taking on the devil in the devil's kingdom. Mm-hmm. And you stuck it out. And you made a very compelling case at dinner the one night for why you were choosing to do that. Just so everyone understands that you're just as adamantly opposed to the behavior. It's not like you're co-signing at all. Talk about the thinking that went behind that decision. I think it's important.
Sure. Well, first, when you back up to the 2016 election, my opponent, Debbie Wasserman Shultz, was heading the Democratic National Committee, and she was not playing fair. We all know that now. I think a lot of us knew it then. She had just denied access to the voter database to the Bernie Sanders campaign in the days before I decided to jump into a primary challenge against her. So when folks maybe are critical, of me of not being, maybe they think I'm not being critical enough of the Democratic establishment because I'm running as a Democrat, my response is, I ran against the head of the Democratic National Committee. You can't get much more critical of the establishment than that. I look at my district here, and it's an overwhelmingly Democratic district. Of course, it's been gerrymandered the way 90% of the districts are around the country, either a safe Democratic district or a safe Republican district. So traditionally, whoever wins this primary, the Democratic primary, will be the next representative of this district. So it made perfect sense to challenge Wasserman Shultz in a Democratic primary. And I'm doing so again. Now, that could change. The news that we've learned about the destruction of the ballots. Let's see what the responses of the Broward County Democratic Party, the Miami-Dade Democratic Party, the State Democratic Party. let's see if this close primary is still going to be one where the field is very much not a level playing field, where it's tilted for the incumbent. Here, like in many districts, the incumbent runs away from discussions, debates, public forums with candidates, and has all other kinds of advantage, you can say, both official and unofficial types of advantage. I saw a poll recently reported that 71% of millennials are now registered as independents, non-party affiliation. The day could come where it could make perfect sense to run as an independent, not just in my district, but in other districts around this country. It's premature for me to make that kind of a decision. I've been a Democrat almost my whole life. There were 3 years where I was an independent. And I would like to see change come within the Democratic Party. I know there are those out there, Green Party people, libertarians, and others who might say that's a fool's errand. The Democratic Party is never going to change. And I think it's still perhaps a little too early to reach that verdict. There's so many folks within the Democratic Party, so many progressives like me who are fighting for change. And 2018 is going to be a big year to see where this party is heading. Steve, I can't hear you.
Turn my mic off. So I want to just say this. I think that it's important, and I want you to know how important it is to me anyway. We had Justin Santapietro on, who's running for District 9 Congress seat in Virginia. Right. And it's a very conservative coal mining area, and he's running as a Democrat, but he's running as a New Deal type of Democrat. He's running as an MMTer, quite frankly, an unabashed MMTer. And he's a guy who has a lot of the very, very same beliefs you have, a lot of the same economics background. He's worked on the Hill. You guys have there's some synergies there. I'm seeing this crop up all over the nation. Yes. People, I wish the Green Party would do it, but they refuse to adopt these things either. But I'm watching, and you have thrown me a few bones here and there, and it has gone noticed, and I do appreciate it. It's nice to know that there's someone of your stature who understands that we are not fiscally constrained. We're not constrained. The ability to spend money is not constrained to taxation. It's not constrained to bond sales. It's not constrained. The bottom line is it's a political issue. We've been lied to for 40 freaking years, more than that actually. But 40 years of neoliberalism has destroyed the infrastructure of this nation. It's destroyed the healthcare of this nation. It's destroyed everything that was ever good about this nation, including the humanities. We've lost the arts. We've lost everything in this neoliberal scourge. And I see you, Tim, I'm just going to be honest with you. Even if me and you aren't like that 100% aligned on this, we're a good 90 plus. And that's good enough for me, man. And,
thank you. I agree with you.
Hope.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Going all the way back to the 1990s, I was a lawyer, became a law professor. And during that period of time, I was writing a lot about financial deregulation, critical of deregulation, but also writing about macroeconomics from a very Keynesian perspective. And I met Randy Wray and Warren Mosler during the 1990s, spoke quite a bit with them about their ideas that became, MMT. And I always considered myself a fellow traveler. When you're dealing with such intricate theories, academic theories, it's hard to get 100% agreement on everything. And I see the differences that we have to be really minor ones in many ways. I think the important point is what you just mentioned. I think MMT, and my own feeling is that I don't see any real fiscal constraints in pursuing an expansionary social policy, a New Deal, for instance. We don't have to rely on taxing to pay for things. And that is the orthodox conventional thinking that should have been discredited many years ago. If you look back to President John Kennedy's speech in 1962, I don't know if you've ever read it or been aware of his speech at Yale University, in which he talked about the myths of economic policy. And the very top myth that he was talking about was the fixation with deficits and austerity. And he pointed out that if you just take a look at our own country's economic history, we see that that fixation with deficits is a very flawed one. You could go back to the New Deal and World War II, and you can see that the federal government did an awful lot of deficit spending, and they were the most successful period in American history, economic history. The 1940s certainly was. Now, it's a shame that it took a wartime emergency and wartime spending for the government to open up the purse strings and spend very generously. But it is impressive what happened. The federal spending pretty much like doubled in the first year of the war, and the economy boomed. The three main war years, the real economic growth rate was something like averaging 15% a year. And the main problem that policymakers had, of course, was inflation, a demand pull kind of inflation, and they managed to bring together a lot of different strategies to keep inflation during the war years at something like 3%. So, and then after the war, that expansionary fiscal policy continued in many ways with the GI Bill of Rights and the Marshall Plan. And those two programs were really the lodestar, I think, that we should be looking at today. We look at foreign aid today, and the conventional thinking, the orthodox way of looking at it is, if we give money to some other country in the form of direct foreign aid, it's a drain on us and it's helping them and hurting us. That wasn't the Marshall Plan history. The $13 billion, I believe it was, which was a lot of money back in the late 1940s and early 50s, the funds that we gave to Western Europe, to war-torn countries, helped the American economy almost directly. Those countries didn't have all the resources to rebuild, and the foreign aid that we gave them came right back to American firms that went over to Europe and rebuilt roads and factories and their education systems as well. And then, of course, the GI Bill of Rights, which was an enormous outlay of money that gave low-interest mortgage loans, low-interest business loans, and tuition-free higher education at any university, public or private, anywhere in the world, plus a living stipend to returning GIs. And we're talking 16 million returning GIs were eligible for these GI Bill of Rights benefits. And you take a look at all that spending on the GI Bill. Again, it more than paid for itself several times over in the form of higher economic growth rates and higher tax revenues that the beneficiaries who are now productively employed would pay to the government. So even if you looked at this through the paradigm of orthodox economics, it more than pays for itself. Steve, your mic is off.
Okay, I want to embarrass you a little bit.
Sure.
It's not really embarrass you. It's the high point of my life to this day, seriously. And I want to show this to the folks because you're a very gracious man. And so this is actually good sport here. I'm going to show when I first met you, the very first time I met you. It's about a minute long. Here we go. Give me 1 second.
Okay.
Here we go. So, folks, this is Tim and I.
And of course, Steve, you all know.
Hello, party people. Hello.
So they were just talking about what? In DC, how to afford. I don't get it. You need to start over.
No, we're to start. So we've been talking about the fundamental issues regarding the economy in the United States as we speak. And really, we've gone all the way back to Roosevelt, and we've worked our way up through Kennedy and talked a little bit about Reagan. And I think we're starting to get to the crash and discussing some of the differences in approach in looking at deficits and debt. As we've talked about foreign countries owning U.S. debt and the difference between debt denominated in our own currency versus debt that we owe to an external source like China and so forth. So I think that Tim and I largely believe a lot of the same things. Tim is looking at it slightly differently. I'll let him explain that. But
well, I'm trying not to speak in academic terms. After 20 years of academic debates, I'm tired of it, and mostly trying to analyze things or discuss things from more of a historical perspective and a policy perspective. And folks realize, I think, that this country is upside down, that policy has been favoring very elite interests in society and ignoring working folks and middle-income folks. So how do you rebalance that? And of course, it's a mixture of monetary policy and fiscal policy to put people back to work. So that's the level that I've been trying to talk about it. And, we have spoken about having paid for it. And that's gotten us into some of these esoteric academic discussions. Right. Yeah.
Well, I think, obviously.
All right, so that's enough of that. But that was just fun. I cannot tell you. I walked into that room and I felt like I was in the presence of like James Hetfield of Metallica. It was a really cool moment for me. So thanks for being a good sport and letting a guy like me have a talk with a guy like you. It was really nice of you.
I enjoyed it. And you've really done a lot for MMT, Steve. Real Progressive says, MMT to me, again, I first started learning about this framework from Warren Mosler and Randy Ray way back in the 90s. And, it was very much confined to academic circles. And I think you and Real Progressives are among those who have popularized these ideas, which is so important.
Thank you. So, but let's talk about this a little bit more. I think the thing that is really intriguing to me is most of the people coming up, even the so-called Bernie-crats and all the others, are really suffering from what I call an imagination deficit. Mm-hmm. They're really, really stuck in these quick hits like Fight for 15 or Medicare for All. It's like they dink and dunk around the edges. They're afraid of really, really doing something amazing. Mm-hmm. And you go back in time, and you're the history major here, man. You're the guy that gets the real richness of the past. We used to think big in this country. Yeah. We used to really, really think big. The Great Society, the New Deal. I mean, the Square. I mean, there's been so many opportunities for us to take this and run with it, but we've literally gotten afraid to spend money. And now all we do is go into bank loan debt. Everybody is in bank debt. We're finding bank money everywhere because we've cut the federal spigot off.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about thinking big and having an imagination to serve the people.
Well, I'm right on with you there, Steve. I think we have been stuck with this idea that it's only incremental change that's politically possible, and incremental change which is kind of responsible policy making. And I think both are flawed. I think, first of all, the problems that our society is now facing are so enormous that incremental change will not solve these problems whatsoever. We need a new deal. We've needed a new deal for probably the last 20 years, but the financial crisis of 2008 has made it that much more urgent. And, I don't want to go on with a lot of statistics, but, we look at the distribution of wealth and income, and it's the most top-heavy perhaps in all of American history. I know one economist recently said it's the most top-heavy distribution since ancient Egypt. Now, I don't know if that's hyperbole or not, but it is shocking how just, a few dozen families seem to own this entire wealth of this country, and all the income gains are flowing to the top 1%. Meanwhile, the job market is awful, and it's not reflected in the official unemployment rate whatsoever. So we need large policy, big initiatives to address these problems. And politically, I think incrementalism has been a big loser for progressives and for Democrats. Obama got into office really in the middle of the worst financial and economic crisis since 1933. And unfortunately, he turned to the orthodox thinkers like Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and others. And I think the strategy was very much a trickle-down strategy. The Federal Reserve showered Wall Street with trillions of dollars, whether it was in the form of low interest loans or outright asset purchases. And it has had the effect of helping the top 1%, maybe the top 2 or 3%, and financial markets and real estate markets, a lot of inflation in asset prices. But for ordinary Americans, this has been a silent depression decade. And it has not been a successful strategy for Democrats. While Obama was able to get reelected, I think that masked the meltdown that was occurring within the Democratic Party nationwide. And I'm sure you're already familiar with a lot of those numbers. The Democrats losing something like 1,000 legislative seats over the last decade and being in the weakest position, not just in Congress, but in state legislatures since 1920, 97 years ago.
I want to talk, you bring up a great point, and I want to see if we can touch on 2 quick hits before we get into the sustainability of the campaign that I want to talk about. But two primary things. Number one, we look at history, and obviously the Republicans, they don't even hide that they're the bad guys. They just, hey, man, I'm the bad guy. It's okay. That's what I am. Democrats, though, the way they've approached things, you look at Bill Clinton. We're still suffering the effects of the Clinton decisions, the Clinton economy, cutting welfare, really, really cutting the economy to the bone, taking away all the elasticity out of it, and literally tanking it. I mean, Kelton wrote a great piece, was interviewed for a great piece in Business Insider, basically saying Bill Clinton's surplus destroyed the economy. People to this day still celebrate the Clintons. I mean, they were lining up saying, Hillary had no shame. She was willing to even say, Bill, run the economy again.
Right.
And this is where Democrats literally are. And there's a crew of people out there, deficit house, slugging it out, making sure Democrats wake up. Now, where I think it's interesting, and this is where I'd like you to speak, I want to make sure I give you credit for this, because this is the greatest bumper sticker yet to be made. I despise the end of Fed crew, not because they have a good point or a bad point, but because they won't listen to anything beyond their little end the Fed, right? But you came up with a miraculous bridge between common sense and conspiracy called Mend the Fed. Yes. And the way you did that was pure genius. I mean, it takes a genius to come up with something so simple.
Well, thanks.
Could you talk a little bit about your stance on the Federal Reserve and how they can direct some of the thoughts that you have as it pertains to that?
Sure. Steve, I'll say I don't look at myself and my views on the Fed as genius in any way. Maybe it's a reflection of sort of the deficit in historical perspective that makes it look that way to you. I was a law professor toiling away, critical of Alan Greenspan in the 1990s, critical of Bill Clinton's deregulation of Wall Street, including gutting the Glass-Steagall Act and deregulating derivatives. And, I think I was treated very much like a sort of a Chicken Little, that the sky is falling and people weren't paying much attention. And while the bubble kept growing, what I did was I started to focus much more on the historical experience of central banking and to take a look at how the Fed conducted itself in the 1930s and 1940s. Where the Fed engaged in direct lending to Main Street, to actually to small businesses and medium-sized businesses through the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. Congress had authorized the Fed to do so, and the Fed, I think they were authorized to make up to $280 million in loans to not to banks, but to regular industrial corporations, businesses, partnerships, for instance, but Main Street businesses. And at the same time, we had an enormous infrastructure bank. We didn't call it an infrastructure bank. It was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It was actually created in the final year or two of President Herbert Hoover. And Roosevelt, when he was running against Hoover in 1932, said that the way the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was being operated was a trickle-down approach, and he wanted a bottom-up approach. So under Hoover, this revolving fund, this Reconstruction Finance Corporation, was bailing out big banks, big insurance companies, and big railroads. And it's an interesting parallel to 2008, 2009, where the TARP program, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, was bailing out big banks, big insurance companies, and instead of railroads, of course, it was the big automakers. And Roosevelt wanted to redirect that Reconstruction Finance Corporation to help the Main Street economy, and he did just that. Over the course of 25 years, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation essentially paid for so much of the infrastructure building of the New Deal in World War II, from major seaports and airports to major tunnels and bridges and roads and highways, but also financing school teacher salaries in Chicago and environmental projects and the the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Rural Electrification Administration. Many of these programs were a result of this kind of creative financing. A lot of the New Deal and World War II and post-World War II was deficit spending, no doubt about it. But an awful lot of it also was the creative policies of the central bank, the Federal Reserve, and this enormous infrastructure bank. And when, I guess it's back in 2011, I believe, when the Occupy Wall Street movement was growing, I took part in the Occupy Los Angeles at the time. And I just taught a course, a workshop, I guess you could call it, on the Federal Reserve and Wall Street. And that Occupy encampment had an awful lot of those End the Fed posters and folks who just wanted to completely abolish the Fed. And that's where I came up with, no, let's not end the Fed, let's mend the Fed. Let's make it a people's Fed. Let's make it one that the governing structure of the Fed is much different. It's not controlled just by the big banks, but the governance more reflects society's diverse interests. And the actual policies of the Fed should also be policies that help build a bottom-up recovery, a real strong foundation for the economy, and not just trickle down, helping big Wall Street interests. And right around the same time, I got a call from Senator Bernie Sanders' office. And Bernie was putting together an advisory committee on reforming the Fed. And I joined up on that committee. And it was an interesting committee. It included people like Joe Stiglitz and Jamie Galbraith and Robert Reich and a number of other real progressives, true progressives. And that committee had suggested some governance changes to the Fed, and Bernie introduced legislation to tweak it a little bit, at least make it a little bit less captured by the big banks. That legislation, unfortunately, didn't go anywhere. So, I think this needs to be the agenda for progressives moving forward. Certainly, the insights of modern monetary theory is very important, and I think that should be part of the agenda. But by the same token, the central bank plays such a crucial role, and it is such a flawed central bank that we must talk about reforming it.
Very good. So let me ask you the next question. I think this is probably our closing out here that I think is really important part of this. As we're trying to build this Real Progressives entity, you and I have spoken much in the past about your Progress for All. And I'd asked you many questions about, the legal entity and how you work out a 527 Corp, a 501c4, a 501c3, all these different entities to be able to bring about a vehicle powerful enough to take on groups like the Pete Peterson Foundation that are out there polluting the air with garbage and all these other Koch brother interests that are flooding the world with Trojan horses that make people excited about things that sound good, but really have an underlying means of getting rid of the social safety net and basically all the New Deal protections that are still left, whatever they are. Mm-hmm. How is it that people such as yourself who are operating not only Progress for All, but also running for office, how is it that you can sustain a campaign, not just do one-off protests, not just do things without demands and follow up on the demands? How is it that we can actually start putting teeth to these things? I mean, you look back, and I'm still bitter about the Trump tax return protests, an incredible opportunity to do something really valuable with all those people there And instead, they do a one-off protest just to get at Trump, which really didn't serve progressive community at all. It was a wasted opportunity. And many of these one-off protests tend to be wasted opportunities. Talk to me about sustaining a campaign, putting teeth behind it, and the cost, personal and professionally, for holding to your guns and fighting.
Well, it's a big job, and you've covered a lot in that question. You know, I do think that there are an awful lot of big national organizations that have done a lot of good. Progressive Democrats of America and Democracy for America both endorsed our campaign and were helpful. Some big unions like the National Nurses United and Communication Workers of America also helped us. It's very important. I do think that you find some of these, not the ones I mentioned, but some other, progressive and liberal organizations, quite often inside the Beltway, that the agenda perhaps doesn't always reflect what's needed on the ground. What I liked about our group, Progress for All, was it's very locally based and very engaged on the issues that resonate here in South Florida and across the state of Florida. Now, just to back up, the reason we were able to run such a credible campaign in 2016 was because of all the grassroots support. And that's what's crucial. I'm sure it's helped perhaps real progressives, but it certainly helped my campaign and many others around the country. And they were small donations. I think the average donation for my campaign last time was only $17. So we used to joke, Bernie's was $27 and we were the mini Bernie. But more than 200,000 times somebody clicked on their computer and donated to our campaign. And it gave us the resources that we needed. Now, when the campaign ended, we didn't want to just sort of fold up. A lot of one-time candidates do that. They run, they lose, and you never hear from them again. And these issues are just too important to walk away from. So we started a group called Progress for All. And the reason, where that name came from, it was a New Deal slogan that John Kennedy used in his 1960 campaign. And I love that slogan because you often hear people say, well, what's a progressive? What does it mean to be a progressive? Debbie Wasserman Shultz claims to be a progressive. Everybody, with a D in front of their name wants to say they're a progressive. And I enjoyed saying, and I say it all the time, that it's not truly progressive if it's not progress for all, if it's not helping everyone. Obamacare is one example. We could debate for a long time about the Affordable Care Act. Was it an improvement from what was before? Yes, arguably it was better than nothing. But it left so many people out, something like 29 million people without any kind of health coverage. And those that it even brought in, the premiums and the deductibles are so high that they can't very much afford to even go to a doctor. It has to be an emergency before they're willing to access their health insurance. So what would be a proper type of a solution? Well, a Medicare for all, where everybody is covered. And, it shouldn't sound so far-fetched because so many other countries of the world have that kind of universal coverage. Way back in the 1990s, I was the first executive director for a group called the National Jobs for All Coalition, based in New York, a group of scholars, community activists, faith leaders, and it was to put together a full employment agenda. Again, the kind of approaches that help everyone. And this is what I think people want. They want a type of citizenship that's universal, where we all have certain obligations as citizens, but we all also have certain benefits and rights that come with being a citizen of this country. And I think the people are for this. I'll tell you, I continue to see that the people are way out front ahead of the political establishment. Here in the state of Florida, on the day that I was on the ballot in August of 2016, we had two referendums. One was for medical marijuana, and the other was for solar power. And both of those, the big corporate interests lobbied heavily against them, and spending tens of millions of dollars against them. And my opponent was, completely quiet on these initiatives, of course, because the donor class is the owner class. They own a lot of the political establishment, politicians like Wasserman Shultz. And on that day, you needed a supermajority vote of 60% for those statewide referendums to pass. And they passed overwhelmingly with over 70% votes. So whether you're talking about solar power or the war on drugs or Medicare for all, the people are way out ahead of the establishment here. And not just here in Florida, nationwide. I think this is one of those moments in history where people really want major changes, not incremental changes. That's why Bernie would have won. Bernie Sanders would have been the next president. It would have been the biggest Democratic landslide in more than 50 years if he was leading a good ticket. And it's unfortunately the reason we have Trump. People looked at him and saw him as an outsider and thought he was going to bring major changes. But, you know, he immediately showed his true colors, I think, and embraced the donor class as well. You just take a look at his cabinet filled with billionaires. But I'm hopeful in that I do think the temper of the public opinion, really does want major changes. I think a new deal for this generation is overdue, and the people will get behind it. The problem is a political one, and it's a money one. You know, the donor class is always contributing. In the past year and a half, Wasserman Shultz has been building up her war chest. And where's she raising the money? Of course, she's raising it from the political action committees, from industry after industry. She's taken so much money from Wall Street and fossil fuels, predatory payday lenders, big pharma, private health insurers. We won't take a penny from any of those interests. So we're dependent on those small donations. Last time we ran a campaign in the middle of a presidential election contest, we were able to tap into that grassroots energy, and we're hoping and counting on that to happen again. You know, this time around, we want to build up enough of a war chest where we can pay for an audit of our vote. We can also pay to contest the election if they try to steal it. And that requires small donations from thousands and thousands of people. Now, I know 2017 seems so early for folks to be opening up their wallets, their pocketbooks, and donating, but we're at the end of the year, and 2018 is upon us. So, you know, I would just urge folks to try to be as generous as they were last year. Go to our website at timcanova.com, throw a few dollars, and even as importantly, share the message on social media. Talk to your family, talk to your friends. You know, this is such an important race here. Can you imagine having Debbie Wasserman Shultz in Congress for yet another term? She's the epitome of what's wrong with the Democratic Party, and not just the Democratic Party, but the entire political establishment in Washington. We need MMTers. We need people who understand what needs to be done from an MMT type of a perspective, a robust Keynesian perspective. And we need people who are not bought and paid for, that are willing to fight for the people every step of the way. You know, it has taken a toll on me personally. It's been very tough. I'm not a person I'm not independently wealthy. I'm just an average Joe like everybody else, you could say. I've got to work for a living. I work real hard in the classroom teaching, and I've been spread very thin, you can say. And we have a lot of special interests that have been gunning after me in the local press and elsewhere here in Florida. And, you know, it's been a trial, you know, a baptism by fire, you could say. But I think we're coming out of this stronger than ever. And I take a lot of hope out of we put our resources into this lawsuit against the Broward Supervisor of Elections. A lot of folks, including a lot of progressives and a lot of Democrats, tried to dissuade us from doing this. I thought it was the right thing to do. I've poured more than $30,000 of my own money. I don't own a home. I'm a renter. I put it into my campaign. I put it into the lawsuit, and lots of folks have been contributing what they can. And it's beginning to bear fruit already. I mean, what that lawsuit has revealed is that right here in deep blue Broward County, there's a real rot in our election system. And it's got to change. It's only going to change if the grassroots stays engaged and active and doesn't go back to sleep, and identifies campaigns like our campaign here to contribute to. You know, last year in 2016, it was very easy for me. Even 6 months before I became a candidate, I was throwing small donations to the Bernie Sanders campaign, and millions of people were. And now you don't have Bernie on the ticket. It might be easy for folks to not pay attention because it's an off-year election, a midterm election. But please identify the key races, and please take a look at ours. This is a key one. We got to finish what we started. And, you know, all those issues that animated us last time: jobs, income, health care, the environment, the war on drugs, racial equality, rights for women and LGBTQ. All of that is still there. And probably more so than ever, the election integrity issue is there now. Our race now represents, in many ways, ground zero of this election integrity battle.
I love it. Tim, I want to thank you for your times. I hope you'll come back again soon.
Of course.
I know that you're talking to Dr. Joe.
Yes.
Excited to see you come back there as well. In the meantime, I appreciate immensely having somebody who has your national presence to be able to leverage New Deal language that people will begin to destroy this imagination deficit and start demanding people do better. And you're the starting point for that. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. I'd love to be back sometime. And thank you for everything you're doing. Keep up the good work. Keep fighting.
Thank you so much, Tim. All right, folks. Thank you so much, Tim. Have a good night, everybody.